The desert outside Al-Qadisiyah is quiet in the way only battlefields get quiet before they swallow men. February 23, 1991. Inside a canvas command shelter stitched together with rope and arrogance, Iraqi Republican Guard officers crowd around a sand-stained map. Diesel fumes hang heavy. So does certainty. Colonel Hassan al-Nouri doesn't raise his voice. He doesn't need to. He taps the map once with a wooden pointer, the way German panzer commanders once tapped maps in Normandy, convinced history was on their side. "The Americans will come here," he says, circling the eastern approaches. "Daylight, artillery first, armor second, textbook." The officers nod. They've studied the enemy, memorized him, broken him down into diagrams and assumptions. Al-Nouri was trained in the Soviet Union, taught that wars are won by discipline, positioning, and steel, not theatrics. He knows American doctrine as well as any NATO instructor. To him, the enemy is predictable, mechanical, overconfident. Outside, rows of T-72M tanks crouch in sand berms like waiting predators. Hull down, guns forward, fields of fire overlapping with mathematical precision. This is how battles are supposed to be fought. The crews believe it because belief has always been rewarded. These men aren't militia. They're veterans, survivors of 8 brutal years against Iran. They've watched tanks burn. They've heard crews scream inside steel coffins, and they're still here. That means something. Hands move across cold metal. Breaches are checked. Ammunition racks slammed shut. The smell of grease and cosmoline clings to everything. The tanks feel alive under their palms. The T-72 is not elegant, but it is brutal. A 125mm smoothbore. Autoloader humming like a clock counting down someone else's life. Designed for close, violent combat. The kind the Red Army perfected from Kursk to Berlin. Al-Nouri believes in numbers. He always has. Iraq fields thousands of tanks. The coalition, far fewer. Defenders win wars, history teaches. Rommel learned it in North Africa. The Israelis learned it on the Golan. Now the Americans will learn it here. Intelligence reports confirm everything Al-Nouri wants to hear. Enemy concentrations near Wadi al-Safra. Supply lines stretched thin, flanks exposed. A frontal attack is inevitable. It has to be. There is no other logical choice. What Al-Nouri doesn't know, what none of them know, is that logic is exactly what the Americans are weaponizing against him. The buildup near the Wadi is theater, noise, deliberate visibility. The real movement is happening far to the west, beyond the maps pinned to canvas walls, beyond Iraqi patrol routes, beyond imagination itself. There, an entire armored corps is moving at night, silent, fast, unseen. But here, in the Republican Guard positions, confidence remains unbroken. Crews load APFSDS rounds with ritual precision, each motion drilled into muscle memory. Fire, reposition, fire again. Soviet doctrine distilled into instinct. Al-Nouri lights a cigarette. The flame dances in his eyes. "Tomorrow," he says quietly, "they'll learn what armored warfare really is." He believes this moment will define him, that historians will write his name next to the great defenders, that this desert will become proof that American technology cannot erase experience. The temperature drops. Night settles like a blanket. Wind drags sand across steel hulls. Somewhere, an engine coughs, then goes silent. Far away, too far for Iraqi sensors to detect. Thermal optics bloom to life in shades of green. Turbines begin to spin, low and distant, like a storm rolling in from another world. The Guard waits, certain, prepared, facing east. They have no idea the war is already coming from somewhere else, and when it arrives, it will not fight the way wars are supposed to be fought. Part 2 will begin with the first thermal contact, when Iraqi crews see ghost tanks firing from distances they were never trained to fight. The night was a living thing, cold, black, and merciless. Dust whipped through the desert like ghosts trying to warn the living. Colonel Walid al-Tamimi squinted through his T-72's starlight optics. The scopes hummed faintly, amplifying shadows into shapes, but the shapes didn't match the sounds. The desert was alive with engines that shouldn't exist. He climbed out of the turret, inhaling the metallic tang of cordite before a single round had fired. His radio was spitting static and panic in equal measure. Forward elements were calling in coordinates that didn't exist, reporting columns of American armor deep in sectors thought to be empty. The numbers made no sense. 3 kilometers west, 4 kilometers northwest. Moving at speeds his T-72s could never match. Walid studied the terrain, checked his range card. Maximum effective fire for the T-72 at night, 800 meters if the moon played kindly. The moon ignored him, a sliver hiding behind clouds. Somewhere in that darkness, Master Sergeant Ryan Callahan's M1A1 Abrams prowled. Thermal optics painting the night in shades of green, white, and fire. Engines hummed with preternatural precision. He could see heat where Walid saw nothing. Tanks crouched in berms, trucks idling, artillery that might as well have been toys. Callahan didn't aim at what he could hear. He aimed at what he could see. The first target, a T-72 positioned 3 kilometers distant, perfect hull down, completely invisible to its own crew. The Abrams gunner acquiesced. The laser pinged, range calculated instantly. The ballistic computer adjusted for wind, sand density, and even Earth's subtle rotation. The shot left the barrel at 170 meters per second. In less than 2 seconds, the first T-72 erupted in a confined, brutal burst of fire. The turret lifted, twisted, and landed upside down. A metal coffin spilling smoke and heat. Walid saw only the flash, only heat. The sound came seconds later, echoing through the sand like the desert itself was groaning. The crew scrambled. Fire control systems scanned, searched, panicked. Guns traversed blindly. They fired at engine noise, at shadow, at ghost signatures. One round buried itself in sand behind the Abrams. Another overcorrected into nothing. Callahan's Abrams didn't pause. He shifted, angled, reversed, advanced, each movement measured. Seconds stretched. Another T-72 lit up on his thermal screen. Impact, detonation, silence for the crew that didn't know they were already doomed. Desperation swept through Iraqi radios. Orders, cries, confusion in a dozen dialects. Units shouted for coordinates, for guidance, for anything that could make tactical sense. They were aiming at echoes. They were firing into the abyss. Every fifth Iraqi shell was tracer, a neon arc revealing their position to the unseen enemy. Every American round was invisible. Invisible until it was already inside. Far to the east, Captain H.J. Moreno's cavalry troop navigated the storm. 9 Abrams, 13 Bradley IFVs, navigating blind with only thermal sight as their compass. Dust and sand turned noon into twilight. Visibility, nearly zero. Yet the thermal optics cut through it. Metal glowed, engines burned bright. Heat betrayed every Iraqi formation. Moreno's sensors picked up over 150 enemy vehicles, a full mechanized brigade entrenched exactly as Soviet manuals dictated. The map didn't show them. Intelligence didn't know they existed. The desert hid them until now. Soviet doctrine said the defender would prevail. Moreno didn't care. "Contact!" he barked into the comms. "Enemy armor! Hundreds! Engage!" The order unleashed a storm of fire. Simultaneous, coordinated, perfect. Depleted uranium sabots flew. 25mm autocannons shredded light armor. Machine guns tore through exposed infantry. Bradley IFVs laid waste to BMPs with impunity. Every shot precise, every impact catastrophic. Rounds arced overhead, streaking into the sand like molten comets. 125mm shells slammed into dunes, kicking up brown clouds, some bouncing harmlessly off rocky ridges. A few found purchase, exploding against the hulls of Iraqi T-72s. Shards of tungsten pinged uselessly against M1A1 Abrams composite armor, scattering into the desert like sparks from a blacksmith's forge. The Americans didn't pause. They pressed forward, engines growling, guns firing on the move. Stabilized systems kept their cannons locked on target, even as the tanks clawed through hard pan sand at 35 kilometers per hour. 23 minutes. That's all it took. 23 minutes of relentless, industrialized slaughter. Iraqi crews scrambled. Turrets turned, binoculars swept, radio chatter screamed. Nothing could be seen in the dust and shadow. Captain Fadi Jassim stood in his hatch, searching the night with wide eyes. A single round from a distant Abrams slammed through the turret, vaporizing him in a burst of fire and twisted steel. By the time the dust settled, Major H.R. Conway's cavalry troop had carved a 9-kilometer swath through Iraqi positions. 39 T-72s reduced to molten shells, 30 BMP infantry vehicles shredded, 27 trucks destroyed, anti-aircraft guns silenced. 162 Iraqi soldiers staggered from the smoke, surrendering to the green-eyed ghosts that had hunted them unseen. American losses? Minimal. 1 Bradley hit by friendly fire. No Abrams lost. 145 rounds of 120 mm, 550 rounds of 25 mm fired in perfect orchestration. The Iraqis had no understanding, only terror. How do you fight an enemy you cannot see? How do you strike a foe that sees you perfectly, yet remains invisible? The following day, February 27th, the Iraqi Al-Medina Division, elite veterans hardened by 8 years of war with Iran, dug into a ridge south of Basra. Hull-down positions, overlapping fields of fire stretching 2,000 meters. Their ridge was a fortress, a textbook kill zone. Major General Samuel R. Klein's 1st Armored Division crested the distant dunes at 1500 hours. Silhouettes against the pale sky. This was supposed to be the decisive battle. The Medina commanders loaded sabot rounds, adjusted ranges. Their doctrine demanded patience. Let the Americans approach, let them enter the trap. But the trap had already been sprung. While the Medina Division's eyes were fixed to the south, Klein's battalions swung east and west in a massive, converging envelopment. 3 armored brigades, 350 M1A1 Abrams, moving in perfect arcs, closing like a fist. At 15:30, the ridge erupted, not from the expected frontal assault, but from both flanks at once. American tanks opened fire from over 300 meters. Thermal sights lit up Iraqi armor like a grid of green and white fire. "Traverse left! Traverse right!" Iraqi commanders screamed. Turrets twisted, guns fired blindly. 1, 2, 3 targets at once. No hits. Confusion reigned. Captain Bradley Weber's tank company struck from the west. His gunner acquired, fired, shifted to the next target before the first round hit. Acquire, fire, shift, acquire, fire, mechanical precision. Some T-72s managed shots of their own. 125 mm shells launched into the air, arcs glowing against the desert sky. One found an Abrams frontal armor plate. The kinetic energy dispersed by the Chobham composite armor. The tank rocked, a sledgehammer inside. Crew ears rang, hearts thudded, but the driver pushed forward. Scratched, shaken, unbroken. The crew returned fire. Thermal optics painting enemy heat signatures in a dance of death. Their rhythm never faltered. Their advantage was absolute. The Medina Division stared in disbelief. Their fortress had become a tomb. Every ridge, every position, every expectation overturned. The Americans had fought from every angle, unseen, untouchable, unstoppable. And as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the desert, the Americans kept advancing, green-eyed ghosts across a battlefield where doctrine and experience were powerless against innovation, technology, and absolute coordination. The penetrator slammed into the turret ring of the T-72, the fragile junction between hull and turret, and for a moment, the desert held its breath. Then the turret erupted in fire, a pillar of orange and black smoke shooting 20 meters into the sky. Ammunition and propellant detonated in a single, devastating pulse. Above, reconnaissance drones and attack helicopters marked another kill silently. The Iraqi Al-Nimr Division tried to react. Reverse slope, use the ridge, classic armored tactics. But the Americans already controlled the high ground. Tanks on the ridge fired down into entrenched positions, every movement of Iraqi armor backlit against pale sand. Every turret, a glowing thermal signature. The veterans of the Iran-Iraq War charged forward in desperation, trying to close the distance where their antiquated optics worked. They made it 400 meters before the first M829DU rounds tore through them. Others abandoned their vehicles entirely, sprinting across fire-scorched sand, surrendering to infantry they had never seen. 2 hours. That's all it took for the 2nd Armored Division to shred Al-Nimr into a non-fighting force. The count was clinical. 192 T-72s destroyed, 130 armored personnel carriers incinerated, 44 artillery pieces silenced. Forward observers recorded every strike, aerial drones confirmed each one, and after-action reports would be analyzed in military academies for decades. American losses? Minimal. 1 M2 Bradley lightly damaged. No Abrams lost. The math wasn't just favorable, it was obscene. The reason wasn't just firepower, it was sight. Iraqi tank crews trained on TPDK-2 optical rangefinders, advanced for 1976, obsolete in 1991. Every shot required manual calculation, estimate range, adjust for wind, account for vehicle speed. Maximum effective fire, 1,800 meters in daylight, far less at night or in dust. American gunners didn't guess. Staff Sergeant Daniel Gauthier sat behind an AN-VSG-2 thermal sight, 2nd-generation FLIR. It detected heat differences as small as 2 degrees Celsius. Tanks idling in the desert radiated as bright as furnaces. Even the movement of crew inside hatches was visible. Pitch-black night, sandstorm, zero ambient light. Gauthier's thermal screen showed 3 T-72s dug in 3,400 meters away. Engines glowing, barrels still warm from earlier fire. His laser pinged, range solved in milliseconds. The fire control system calculated wind, ammunition temperature, and barrel wear. Crosshairs locked. Fire. The round left the barrel at Mach 4.9. The T-72 detonated 2.3 seconds later. The crew never saw a muzzle flash, never heard a report. They were dead before understanding they had been observed. The gap between Iraqi and American capability was a canyon, 1,800 meters versus 3,400. Darkness versus infrared vision, predictable versus unstoppable. Then came speed. Each Abrams carried a 500 horsepower gas turbine, roaring like a tornado, propelling 63 tons to 67 kilometers per hour. The T-72 diesel, venerable and reliable, barely hit 45 kph. When Sef Corps' Hail Mary flanking maneuver launched, American armored brigades covered 260 kilometers in just 38 hours. Iraqi commanders assumed methodical movement, artillery preparation, rest periods. Instead, armored ghosts appeared in their rear areas before scouts even had time to confirm movement. The brigade commander outside Objective Sandstorm checked his map. Units that had been 150 kilometers southwest the previous day were now 12 kilometers east. He assumed misreporting, confusion, a mapping error. Thermal sights confirmed the truth, but the real killer was the fire control system. The M1A1 could acquire, calculate, and destroy targets while moving across dunes at 40 kph. Stabilized guns, hydraulics, gyroscopes, precision computers. Iraqi gunners had to stop, aim, fire. Americans acquired, fired, and killed without pause. The Americans didn't negotiate. They didn't argue. They brought physics. The M829DU sabot was a very specific kind of violence. 10 pounds of solid, depleted uranium. No explosives, no flare, no theatrics. Just mass multiplied by velocity squared, pure kinetic inevitability. When the M256 120mm smoothbore fired, the sabot accelerated down the barrel at 8,100 meters per second squared. The petals peeled away mid-flight, harmless aluminum shards falling to the sand like autumn leaves. What remained was a 22mm dart of depleted uranium, traveling faster than 5 times the speed of sound, dense, unstoppable. It carried enough kinetic energy to pierce 650 millimeters of rolled homogeneous armor. T-72M armor had been revolutionary in the mid-1970s. Layers of steel, ceramic, and composite arrays designed to defeat NATO tungsten rounds. It had protected crews from every threat of the Cold War. But in 1991, Iraq was fighting yesterday's armor with yesterday's tactics. The Al-Furat division sat entrenched on a ridge south of Basra, confident in their frontal armor, convinced that their hull-down positions and turret discipline would survive an American assault. Sergeant First Class Martin Reyes watched through his thermal sight at 760 meters. His gunner tracked a turret poking above the sand. Fire control calculated the shot in milliseconds. Acquire, fire. The penetrator struck the turret front, the thickest armor where the Soviets had concentrated protection. For a heartbeat, the metal resisted. Then physics asserted itself. The dart pierced steel and ceramic, ripped through the breech of the 125mm gun, and entered the crew compartment. Inside, 3 men crouched, surrounded by propellant charges and ammunition. The interior flash was white-hot. The detonation propagated instantaneously. Overpressure found the weakest point, the turret ring. Hydraulic mechanism strained and failed. 40 tons of metal launched the turret into the air. Smoke trailed, flames licking its twisted steel as it crashed 15 meters from the hull. The hull burned for nearly an hour, a furnace where once men had sat. Iraqi tank crews had drilled to minimize exposure. Hull down, only the turret visible. Front armor angled. Every doctrine taught for survival. None of it mattered against physics traveling at Mach 4.9. Captain Derek Sloan's gunner didn't hesitate. Another hull-down T-72, 350 meters distant. Only the turret visible. The penetrator struck the gun mantlet. 9 inches of composite armor. It shattered. Breech, crew compartment, ammunition carousel. 24 rounds, each with surrounding propellant. The turret vanished in a white-hot bloom. Debris rained down. Smoke twisted into the sky. The ridge that had seemed invincible an hour ago was now a graveyard of metal, fire, and twisted steel. The Al-Furat division, once Iraq's finest armor, stared helplessly at a reality they had not trained for, could not comprehend. American armor continued its inexorable advance. Stabilized guns, thermal optics, laser rangefinders, and ballistic computers made every shot inevitable. Every tank that moved, every engine that warmed, every crew that breathed was a target. Physics didn't need strategy. Physics didn't need courage. Physics only needed mass, velocity, and the certainty of calculated inevitability. By the end of the day, dozens of Iraqi tanks were reduced to smoking hulls, their crews either dead or surrendering to unseen Americans. Their skill and bravery rendered useless against a technology and physics they could not fight. The desert had been impartial. It had only measured forces, and the Americans had brought far too much. Steel rained across the sand, shards and twisted plates bouncing 50 meters, scouring the desert with a rhythm like artillery without sound. Iraqi crews did everything they had trained for. Angled their hulls, reversed into deeper revetments, fired smoke grenades to obscure vision. Nothing worked. The Americans didn't need clear line of sight. Thermal optics cut through smoke and dust. The depleted uranium penetrators didn't care about angles, armor thickness, or doctrine. They struck with the inevitability of a falling star. Iraqi crews were dead before they even realized the enemy was there. By February 28th, the battlefield was a graveyard. T-72s lay on their sides, turrets torn off, interiors gutted by fires that turned metal into skeletal forms. BMPs overturned. Trucks and support vehicles littered the ridges. Entry and exit holes from the 22mm darts pierced 650 millimeters of composite armor like it was paper. The T-72 had been engineered to survive NATO threats of the mid-1980s. Against American armor of 1991, it might as well have been a wooden toy. That 6-year technological gap had become a chasm. Colonel Hassan Sadi's radio crackled at 0340 hours. His southern battalion, deployed along the ridge south of Basra, had gone silent. Not retreating, not maneuvering, gone. 18 T-72s, 3 companies of mechanized infantry, vanished. Sadi sent a scout platoon. 30 minutes later they returned, pale-faced. The battalion no longer existed. Tanks were burned shells, interiors charred beyond recognition. BMPs split open, their crews nowhere to be found, no crater evidence, no visible airstrikes, only systematic, industrialized death. Sadi traced the destruction on his map, called Division Headquarters. Similar reports echoed across the front. Units went silent. Battalions disappeared. One after another. Major Khalid, commander of the Kalma Division's reconnaissance company, was trained to see the unseen, to provide early warning, to save armored brigades from traps and ambushes. On February 25th, he failed utterly. Not for lack of skill, not for lack of courage. The Americans had redefined the rules. Infrared optics, laser rangefinders, stabilized main guns firing on the move. Kinetic energy so immense it made armor irrelevant. Nothing in Khalid's experience, nothing in Soviet doctrine, could match what he was facing. The desert became a theater of ghosts. Thermal signatures lit up like lanterns in a black void. Sabot rounds ripped through tanks at distances that seemed impossible. Crews inside their vehicles were dead before the first flash reached them. Communication networks failed. Radios filled with frantic static and confusion. Sadi looked across the map. Entire brigades had vanished in hours. Only smoke and burned metal remained. Victory, as they understood it, had been stolen from them. Somewhere, invisible yet omnipresent, the American tanks moved like shadows given flesh. They did not pause. They did not hesitate. They did not negotiate. Physics and engineering were on their side. By the time the sun rose, the desert had delivered its judgment. Thousands of tons of Soviet steel lay twisted and broken. Hundreds of Iraqi soldiers were dead or captured. The Americans had not lost a single Abrams. The survivors didn't speak of bravery. They spoke of ghosts, of machines that saw them while remaining unseen. The war colleges would call it decisive. The historians would study it for decades. But in that sand-swept silence, for the men on the ground, it was simply incomprehensible. The battlefield was not just a victory of force. It was a victory of inevitability. And for the Iraqi armored divisions, the desert had spoken.